The game that still fascinates us all even 23 years later, Gothic 1 by Piranha Bytes, left a lasting impression on many of us when we played it the first time. Its revolutionary ideas continue to captivate players even decades later, forging a loyal fanbase that ended up sticking around longer than any of the original developers probably ever expected. However, after the series concluded with the problematic release of Gothic 3, fans found themselves yearning for the Gothic experience in the video game market, but struggled to really find its unique approach to the RPG genre anywhere else ever since. Even Piranha Bytes themselves could never really reignite the same level of long-term fan interest with their following titles. And I think it's in part because they forgot about the original vision for Gothic and how much importance it placed on creating an immersive world. Because back when the four founders of Piranha Bytes teamed up with the mad scientists who developed the underlying game engine, they all shared this vision to create a game that left behind the hundreds of numbers and tiny little bars and focused on simplicity and progress that could actually be seen, rather than just be reflected in a change of numbers. Which is why one of the cornerstones of the design principles that the founders of Pyrana Bytes aspired to when creating their first game was this focus on immersion. Nowadays, at a time where big titles, even amazing ones like The Witcher 3, have cluttered their HUDs with a plethora of icons, information, and direction guidance, Gothic's minimal approach to its HUD design feels fresh and liberating. While The Witcher 3 has an HP bar, an XP bar, your active sign, your adrenaline levels, your sign charge, your currently active buff, your toxicity level, the time and the weather, a mini-map, your currently equipped weapon, your currently active quest, your quick slot items, your action log. And Gothic has? Well, an HP bar and the name of the character or item you are currently focusing. And this is not to give The Witcher 3 too hard of a time. It's still a fantastic game, but it's kind of funny how its HUD design sort of ended up embodying the hundreds of numbers and tiny little bars that the creators of Gothic wanted to move away from more than 20 years ago. Now, one could argue you have the option to turn all of the HUD elements off in The Witcher 3, but it doesn't really work in the same way. Because the game is fundamentally designed in a way where you need a lot of this information. The game really wants you to juggle between various different abilities and potions, and deal with the according cooldowns and timers to maximize your performance in combat. But the underlying design approaches definitely go beyond surface-level features like HUD options. For example, the lack of a minimap in Gothic is only really feasible, not only because of the size of the world, but also because the paths connecting important locations are structured in such a way that the player can find most things just by a simple description. One of the examples that comes to mind with this is the quest to return the focus to Iberian. All he has to tell you for you to find your way is basically leave the camp, go up the hill, and keep right until you reach the cliff. Having direction descriptions that are this simple would never really work in most of the modern open-world RPGs. Most of them are so large and bloated that some even feel the need to include features that mimic modern GPS systems. So where other games try to impress you with the sheer size of their world and the quantity of different locations, Gothic 1 stayed small, but in doing so, it was free to keep its HUD clear of unnecessary distractions and build a small world that people were incentivized to care about, because they would visit locations and characters again and again throughout the course of the game, and could develop an attachment to these characters and locations. But there is also another factor to immersion where Gothic succeeds. It doesn't need a level indicator next to an enemy's name, because the pecking order and hierarchy between NPCs or wild monsters is fairly clear and easy to understand just by visual indication alone. An NPC has a massive two-handed weapon and the biggest armor around, and he stands in a really important location. He's obviously important and strong. Just look at Thoris. Every new player instantly understood just by his appearance and also by where he stands that he is not only a capable and strong fighter, but also an important and influential figure within the old camp. And Gothic never needed a number next to his name to communicate both how strong and also how important he is. It's only by sticking to the design principles and concepts we mentioned earlier that the devs managed to communicate all of this just by their world building and approach to game design. Yet another aspect of Gothic 1 that I think is very interesting to analyze is quest design. But the interesting thing here is, to some degree the quests are super basic and even bare bones sometimes. There's no super clever writing or surprising emotional plot twists that could be compared to the level of writing in a title like Witcher 3 or Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example. I mean, on a fundamental level, a lot of the Gothic 1 quests are just simple fetch quests even. But why do they still feel rewarding and interesting to complete? I think it's due to the fact that you usually don't just receive random items or some gold as a reward, like in so many other RPGs. Instead, you receive influence over people and a higher standing within the hierarchy of the colony and its camps. You basically work for the access and trust of people. You put in the work, so they ultimately vouch for you and accept you as their equal in their guild, for example. And Gothic is also very good at applying a sort of pressure on the player when he starts out. You feel really compelled to climb up the hierarchy and become stronger because you're just an absolute weakling that can't even handle a simple weapon in a really harsh world. A man whose past doesn't even matter and a literal no-name that doesn't have any friends in the colony yet. This pressure is a great additional driver at motivating the player to do quests, get on good terms with the important people in the colony, and make friends that he can count on. And all of these elements make it feel like you're building a reputation in a living and breathing world, one of the game's ultimate strengths, despite how simple the writing or the mechanics of the quests may be. One very important aspect that I haven't really seen discussed much in regards to immersion is how the hero character and the NPCs are handled almost the exact same way by the game engine. They handle weapons based on their skill level or strength and agility stats, just like the hero does, and eat food or drink potions to replenish their health. And in combination with all the daily routines, the cooking and the sleeping the NPCs do, and the talk of trying to break out or achieve a better life, the game creates this illusion that the game world is full of players that have the same fate as our main character. Because of this, you often feel like you could also be any of the NPCs you meet in the world, and at the same time, the NPCs feel like they could also just be controlled by another player. Which is beneficial in two ways. First, it's just generally more immersive if NPCs feel like they could as well be controlled by real players, of course. But there is also a second point which I think is not as obvious. It also enforces the drive you have to achieve a higher role and become one of the NPCs you meet. I think more than in other games, you feel this carrot hanging in front of you when you meet characters that are stronger than you, because there is very little separation between how the hero character and NPCs work, and achieving that person's status feels very achievable because of this. You instantly feel like you could become the skilled hunter you just met in the wilderness, or the impressive and respected warrior on top of the food chain in a camp. This is an aspect that is a bit more obvious if you again contrast Gothic with Witcher 3. While the excellent story writing and character development in The Witcher are in a league of their own, you don't really have this Gothic effect when interacting with NPCs. It always feels very apparent that Geralt as a hero character is fundamentally different from pretty much all NPCs. They wear clothes that Geralt couldn't wear, they use weapons Geralt couldn't use, or interact with objects in ways Geralt couldn't. Of course, this is a difference that is also dictated just by Geralt being a Witcher, and the underlying book series he comes from. But still, I find this difference between the two games very interesting to analyze in terms of how much the NPCs have in common with the main hero in Gothic, and how that directly shapes the experience you have as a player. Because whenever an NPC uses an object, or performs any of the ambient animations, most of the time the nameless hero can as well. And while it's true that you might not actually make that much use of these ambient animations, I think for the player this moment of experiencing and noticing, hey, I can actually do all the animations and actions too. I am pretty much like the NPCs and the NPCs function almost exactly like me, will stick with the player throughout the game and have a lasting impression. Because from this moment on, every time you see an NPC smoking, relaxing on a bench, or eating, you know that this could be you. You could be the poor guy at the bottom of the food chain being exploited for backbreaking labor. Or you could be in a powerful and socially respected high-ranking position that kicks anyone's ass that dares to confront you. The game really makes it feel like the choice is yours. But much like Piranha Bytes' streak of creating amazing and memorable games had to come to an end, this video must also come to an end soon. There is one more point I want to make though, which is how much Gothic 1 leaves up to the imagination of the player, and how this encouragement of the player's own imagination helps at grounding and immersing him in the game world. Compared to some of the other Piranha Bytes games, Gothic 1 started off really strong in this regard, as it's a game where the player is left in the dark for a long time about what the end game even looks like, or who the final boss is. This whole approach sadly got tossed to the sidelines a bit with Gothic 2, where a lot of the story progression and endgame gets spoilered in the starting dialogue already. And in subsequent Piranha Bytes releases, they tended to add more and more personal detail and backstory to the main character. First, he had annoying family members we had to deal with, and then, in later releases, even a fledged-out detailed backstory with an underlying agenda and motivation that was explicitly tied to the hero's past. In Gothic 1, however, the nameless hero doesn't have a backstory. He has no past that we know of, he has no family or friends. He pretty much is only an empty vessel that can be filled by the player and his imagination. And because of this clever lack of information, the player naturally tends to want to fill in the gaps, which makes identifying with the main character so much easier than Jax from Elex, for example. Another thing is that the nameless hero also doesn't share that much of his own opinion or emotions in dialogues, and often resorts to vague jokes or just a sarcastic tone or questions, which was a deliberate decision by the developers to avoid having the spoken dialogue of the hero potentially clash with the opinions and interests of the player, as Mike explained in one of his recent talks at a storytelling conference in Poland. A talk that could easily warrant its own analysis video, by the way, but we'll leave it at this for today. Let me just end with saying that I'm super excited to create more high-quality content for the Gothic franchise on this channel, so don't forget to subscribe if you want to stick around for more.